All right, everyone. Thanks for coming to our presentation. It is a few minutes past the top of the hour, so we are going to get started. Um, if you have questions during the presentation, we do have personnel on staff to answer Q&A. Please use the Q&A field in the bottom of your screen menu. We will also be doing live Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you do want to have more of a discussion-based question, feel free to save that to the end of the presentation. With that, I'm going to let Ricky and John take it away. So, gentlemen, please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Ricky. I'm the distribution sales manager here for at Lumin for the Western states. I am based in Southern California. I'll hand it over to John just to give a brief introduction, and then we'll take it away from there.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is John Arnaud. Been in the industry now for almost 14 years, so I did recognize quite a few folks that are joining the call today. Thank you, everyone, for taking a portion of your Friday to meet with us. We're really excited to talk about this hot topic. And as Phil had said, make sure if you have any questions along the way, drop them in the chat, and we'll either get to them as we go, or we'll have a Q&A session towards the end that we can make sure we get everything addressed. Take it away, Ricky.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And thanks, everyone, again, for joining. We believe we've prepared some really informative material here for you. So I'm just going to try to click through the screen here. I'm operating remotely. It's a little bit of a delay, so bear with me. So you should see our agenda. Just to give you a quick overview of the agenda, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about who we are. I'm going to hand it back to John to give us a NEM 3.0 overview and discuss some of the economics behind it. I'll come back on to discuss how to strategize around NEM 3.0 and give you a little bit of background on the Lumin Smart Panel. And then John will round us out from there. So Lumin got its start in 2016 with a simple mission in mind, and that is to make ordinary circuits in any service panel smart and responsive. Our core competency has always been in load management. So what we are not, which we're seeing in the market, is like an inverter manufacturer who has a side product as a load controller, or an ESS company that dabbles in load control. This segment of the market gets pretty complex, and one thing that we'll guarantee to you is that we'll always be at the forefront of it. Right, again, sorry about that delay there. So I kind of want to allay some fears about NEM 3.0. Is it an uncomfortable change that we have to head on? Absolutely. Is solar dead in California? Absolutely not. News of its demise, I think, has been greatly exaggerated. I'll point out that Hawaii went through something very similar in 2015 when they ended net metering almost overnight. And as a solar community, we overcame that. And in many ways, their situation was a lot more onerous to what we're going through here in California. So there's no reason why we can't overcome that here in California. To that end, we are seeing a lot of electrification legislation already on the books. So in 2026, there's a mandate that all new home builds can only include electric appliances. In 2035, all new car sales have to be electric in California. And in 2045, Senate Bill 100 sets a target of 100% carbon-free electricity. But moreover, with NEM 3.0, solar will continue to be economical. I'm going to repeat that. It will continue to be economical for homeowners and your business as long as you have storage and smart load control. And you integrate a few strategies, which we're going to go over later. So with that, to talk about some of the economics behind it and an overview of NEM 3.0 itself, I am going to hand it back to John.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. And I appreciate what you said about solar being alive and well in California. Over the past several months, a lot of us have been really active alongside CALSA, doing some of the lobbying events and traveling around the state of California to express our concern on the implications of NEM 3.0. I will say that, as Ricky had mentioned, there is some new stuff that we've got to figure out, and change is always a little bit uncomfortable. Had NEM 3 passed in its initial iteration, that looked a lot different. The utility companies were asking for taxes on solar. They were trying to retroactively go after existing PV sites. And so the work that a lot of folks on this call did in partnership with CALSA, I think really carried a lot of weight to get to, in the grand scheme of things, a somewhat favorable outcome. But nonetheless, we did want to talk a little bit about what this NEM 3.0 thing is, what it looks like, and how it impacts our business. A lot of you, if you've been following what CALSA has been working on, you've probably seen some of these graphs before. But really what this is showing is the root of NEM 3. The big adjustment is an adjustment to the reimbursement rate for net metered kilowatt hours from PV. And so you can see on these graphs, from a visual perspective, this can look pretty scary. NEM 3 is going to impact every vertical within our industry, whether it's residential, commercial, or ag, all of which will have a similar but ever so slightly different impact. But at first pass, yeah, absolutely, this looks scary. You can see that the typical or the average reimbursement rate on a per kilowatt hour basis drops. It seems to drop off of a cliff. And so again, at face value, that looks pretty scary. The why behind all of this, my understanding of it is that the IOUs, this is impacting PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E, so not the munis, but just the major IOU utility companies in California. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get the reimbursement rate for kilowatt hours to reflect the cost they incur for generating a kilowatt hour in that moment in time. And we'll get more into that here in a second. But as we all know, net metering applications submitted on or after April 15th will fall into the NEM 3 bucket. Why I kind of alluded to why they're doing this. I think we all know why. I think solar has become so relevant in California, and the utility companies are finally facing the strength of the competition that we've created in the market. One interesting side note, the how behind all of this. It's tough to say. The utility companies, I think, by and large, aren't quite ready. So what we're going to have is, on April 15th and thereafter, all net metering applications that are submitted will fall into the NEM 3 bucket. Whether or not the utility companies are ready to initiate some of the mechanisms that will be required to start this new reimbursement rate policy, that's an unknown. So you might have customers that land into the NEM 3.0 bucket that I'm going to say the word benefit from NEM 2.0 reimbursement rate structures up until the point the utility companies are ready to kind of create a process behind this. So in the end, nothing to really talk to customers about. It's not something we want to sit at the kitchen table and say, you know, ABC utility company is never going to get their act together, so it's going to take years. You'll still have this. This is a big unknown, but just kind of what to expect. So overall, just kind of as a summary, really what NEM 3 represents is an adjustment to how net metered kilowatt hours are reimbursed from the utility company. And again, at first pass, on an average basis, there's a pretty significant drop. So if you haven't studied this, this is where some of the nuances with NEM 3 really come to light. What you're seeing on this screen is the reimbursement rate card for 2023. This happens to be PG&E. PG&E, we chose this one because I think PG&E has the lowest reimbursement rates, followed by SCE and then SCG&E. I could be incorrect there, but nonetheless, we wanted to choose a conservative one. Weekdays are also a little bit less, and so we chose this just to kind of give a high-level overview of where we're at. So when you look through this rate card, you're going to see a variance throughout the year, and even during the time of day. And these are the kinds of things that we really want to start to pay attention to. And what we really want to hone in on as it pertains to our industry is not worrying so much about what happens at 1 and 2 a.m., but really what's happening while solar is producing, because those are the kilowatt hours that we care about the most. One thing that you should note, if your eyes haven't gravitated towards it already, this little green box. So you can see red, low reimbursement rate, sometimes a fraction of a penny. And when you start to see that heat map turn a little bit green, that is where reimbursement rates start to become very favorable for the customer. You can see peaking out in this case at $2.90 a kilowatt hour. That's not a typo. That's a very real thing. So think about that. Think about what that might mean. So we did that. We thought about what that might mean. So what we did is we created kind of an overlay of what a typical solar production would look like throughout the course of the year. And you can see, certainly not coincidentally, solar production really mirrors the lowest reimbursement rate times. Now, this is just an average 7 kW system with, typical azimuth, typical shading, but it is indicative of kind of a typical solar system production in California. So if you think that this was just a coincidence that solar is producing during reimbursement rate windows that are the least, it is, I think, probably not a coincidence. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to start to prepare for and plan around, and then design and create solutions for customers that are going to, again, try to tap into this higher reimbursement rate window. And I encourage everyone on the call, run your own models and scenarios to see where solar systems in your respective market will land within this matrix. But what I do think you will find is a lot of production during those lower reimbursement rate windows. This is exactly the reason why there's been so much buzz around energy storage systems in California, because what you really want to avoid doing is exporting power from PV back into the grid during these lower reimbursement rate windows. So we have to really start thinking a lot more about how all this stuff comes together. So in the end, what does this mean? One thing that we'll always have going for us, utility costs are going up. Every quarter, every year, if you look back 5 or 6 years, this is a trend that we can effectively bank on. So we'll always have that will always improve the deal economics for customers. From a reimbursement rate, if you look at averages, you can see that the average across the year will fall to about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. We're used to kind of high 20s, low 30s from a reimbursement rate perspective. So there's going to be some adjustment there. CalSA published some studies around what an average PV and solar plus storage system, what the payback or return on investment timeline would look like. And it's modeling out to 9 or 10 years now versus, I think many of us have seen paybacks solar only in the 4 to 5 year range. So some adjustments there. If we choose to keep doing the same thing, that's kind of what we're going to be selling into moving forward. And as we talked about, storage for really the first time ever in California has a true economic value proposition, kind of like what Ricky said about Hawaii. We're going to have kind of a similar theme here in California. We've all been through PSPS events in California. Now we have the economic value proposition to talk about as it pertains to storage as well. One thing that we didn't include here, on the right, you can see the export rate adders. This is for residential only. And the way that this was positioned is sort of a soft landing to help the solar industry transition into this new era. So the rate card that I showed before, the reimbursement rate card, did not include these adders. So for every metric or every moment in time that you saw in that matrix, you can essentially, if your customer signs up in 2023, you can add 2.2 cents if they're in PG&E, 4 cents if they're in SCE. I don't believe SDG&E has this residential export rate adder. And then there's a pretty meaningful opportunity that exists if you are servicing low income or DAC communities. And if you're not familiar with what a DAC community is, I strongly encourage you to look into it. These are historically, I think, underserved communities in our industry that could really benefit from some solar. So anyways, a lot to think about here. And one really interesting thing, in addition to NEM 3, that I think is really important for us to focus on as it pertains to storage. In NEM 2, it was kind of either a gray area or a no-no to discharge kilowatt hours from your ESS directly back into the grid for grid credit. That all changes under NEM 3.0. So now it is permissible for a homeowner to take a kilowatt hour from their battery, and whenever they choose to do so, discharge that back into the grid for export credit. Now, if you think back on a previous slide when we showed those super high export rate intervals, it makes a lot of sense to figure out a good way to start discharging power back to the grid during those windows. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to model a pretty generic example of what this might look like. So in an example where maybe you have a 7 kilowatt system that historically didn't exactly 100% electricity offset for the customer, modeling what that might look like, roughly 11,500 kilowatt hours of production and consumption throughout the course of the year. If you just installed that solar system under NEM 3, no storage, you just did what we've been doing, installed it, all of those, the vast majority of those kilowatt hours would be net metered back to the grid, and they'd be getting an average of about 7 cents a kilowatt hour from a reimbursement rate perspective. Probably not the return the customer wants. That's what's alluding to those 9, 10, 11-year paybacks. But if you look at doing, did we skip one here? Yeah, I think we got a little out of sync here, but that's okay. So if you look at what that might mean from a solar plus storage perspective, and looking at discharging, if you've got 10 kW continuous output capacity and you have 20 or more kilowatt hours to discharge, if you did all of that during those peak rate windows in August and September, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., what you'll find is that you essentially create just over $2,000 in net metering value within that window in time. So that's pretty compelling. If you kind of take a moment and think about that, if a customer has about a $4,000 annual obligation to the utility company, and within a 2-month window, if you're leveraging your energy storage to discharge during a very specific period of time, you can offset over half of your electricity obligation within a 2-month period. Really an interesting concept for customers that are able to do that, where you can imagine using a self-supply feature of your ESS during the vast majority of the year, but within this window, and we'll get more into operating modes here in a second. But in the end, I think a really compelling concept for customers and a great way to kind of keep the momentum in our industry going by maximizing this high export rate window. So it begs the question, are PV and storage systems enough to benefit or to essentially make the most out of this limited high reimbursement rate window? We all know the typical operating modes of energy storage systems. It's worth mentioning that most ESS units out in the field will cover load and demand before they export to the grid, and customer behavior is really difficult to predict. So I say all that because if we know that these export rate windows are a very small subset of time in August and September, and with that in mind, if the customer has their air conditioning running during that window, if their battery is discharging, the battery wants to cover the AC before it starts discharging to the grid, and we're going to miss that opportunity. So what if there was a way we could make this easier for customers to manage how and when they're using electricity and sort of automate a part of this process? So Ricky is going to go ahead and take it from here, and he will talk about how the Lumin Smart Panel and load management will help customers kind of maximize this new era in net metering to get the best return on investment and ultimately have the best experience as it pertains to their new solar and storage system. Ricky, you ready?
Yep. Ready to go. So, oh, sorry. Let's talk about the Lumin Smart Panel for a minute. So you can see a few accolades and milestones there. Always a nice feather in our cap to say we manufacture right here in the US. But what is the Lumin Smart Panel? We sometimes call it LSP for short. So one of the first questions we typically get is Lumin a load center? Do you have a bus bar? Do you have circuit breakers in there? And the answer is no. No to all those questions. We are an add-on device that can be retrofitted onto any existing system or can be implemented at the time of initial system installation. So a big distinction between us and similar competition is that we aren't replacing or tearing out any load center. We're just adding a device. We're an add-on device, and that typically makes our installations quicker than the competition. And another distinction is we can be coupled with any inverter out there, any battery-based inverter out there, which is a huge advantage. You can see the last bullet point there, or the last point there, is that we have integrations with SolarEdge and Enphase, but those are more advanced integrations where we can do SOC, state of charge based load management. But for all intents and purposes, we can work with any inverter out there. Again, since we're not a load center, our systems contain less expensive materials like copper and componentry like circuit breakers, which can be very expensive. And we come in at a lower cost typically than our competitors. And consequently, we're also only about 27 pounds now, so a lot less cumbersome for your installation teams. There we go. Okay. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the fun stuff here. How to strategize around in this NEM 3.0 landscape. So we're gonna keep harping on it. John brought it up several times, and that is the heat map, where we have those couple of hours in the summer months. They're specifically during the hours of 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening, where exporting power can be very lucrative. So a very, very basic strategy would be to schedule your ESS to export power when time of use rates are favorable. But not only to do that, we could, using Lumin, shed loads during those times if it's practical for the homeowner. So in that sense, you can imagine if you're turning off loads or shedding loads, we can just set that ESS to just dump kilowatt hours back back to the grid. And have a nice little return. And then, of course, for the majority of the year, the export rates are basically pennies. So you're going to want to schedule your ESS to self-consume as much as practical is practical for the homeowner during those times. So just a very basic strategy we can work through with our customers to keep the systems as economical as possible. There we go. Okay, so the addition of an energy management system like Lumin is really going to simplify your sales processes and improve the end user customer experience. One thing that I consistently do now is offer my customers a whole home backup. This is like a real big departure. It's almost crazy for me to say that because, like, coming from the PV and storage world, I almost never did that unless they had a huge budget and a lot of physical space to house a lot of redundant equipment. So if you look at number 2 on this list, this is really important. Any customer can now have a whole home backup regardless of inverter type, budget, or available physical space. A whole home backup equals the greatest chance for the home loads to consume PV generation, which should be the goal of any system installed in NEM 3.0. So if you think about a traditional backup system with a few loads and a protected loads panel, say if a customer wants to self-consume, only those few loads in the protected loads panel are going to have access to the PV and battery generation, while the majority of the customer's loads will still be in the main service consuming utility generated power. This is why I like to suggest whole home backups. It's going to give us the greatest chance, bears repeating, greatest chance to consume the PV generation. So a question you might be having right now is, how can customers back up an entire home with a small system? So we'll talk about that right here. And so basically the way we do that is, you never have to worry about having a small inverter and battery bank with Lumin Smart Power Mode, which I've circled here. So when the grid is active, the customer has essentially a limitless energy source in the grid itself. So they can conceivably turn on all their appliances at once if they chose to do so. When the grid goes down, however, Lumin will always try to stay below the continuous power rating of the battery inverter, which in this case it's kind of hard to see, but if you can see it there, it says limit 7,000 watts. So in this case, our inverter is 7 kilowatts. So Lumin will always shed the lowest priority loads first to stay below 7,000 watts during a power outage. And the end customer can actively change around their priority loads in the Lumin app. And essential, that gold category in there, means that those loads always have to be on. Blue is optional, and that means nice to have, but we can turn these off if need be, starting with the lowest priority loads. As you can see, they're already turned off, assuming we're in a power outage at this moment. And then, of course, there's the undesired category, which is the very bottom there, which is you can turn those off. And so essentially what we have here is we have a dynamic critical loads panel, but maybe it's a misnomer calling it a critical loads panel, because it's a whole home backup. Everything's critical. As you can see here, the customer, as point number 2 suggests there, the customer has access to 100% of their loads. They need to toggle a few things on and off. Maybe they want to shut off that AC, as you see pictured there, to take a hot shower, just to stay below the 7,000 watt range. But nevertheless, once again, they have access to 100% of their loads. Let me just get a little mixed up here. A minute. All right, so okay, here we go. Okay. So I've heard from others what I call the prevailing wisdom on the topic of NEM 3.0. I've heard that you can tackle this by doing 1 and 2 there. You build smaller systems. Let's build smaller systems. I know that's something that they are continuing to do in Hawaii. I've heard of increasing training for solar salespeople to improve their technical acumen. Those points are really important. They're valid, and I'm not trying to trivialize that. But I want to point out that those things are made so much easier by having real-time load analysis, which is what Lumin does. Lumin will perform 15,000 readings per second in 1 second interval data. So what that means is that a solar salesperson doesn't have to be super precise about right-sizing a solar plus storage system, because Lumin will automatically monitor and control and effectively inject intelligence into the system. We already talked in the previous slides about how you can build smaller, modestly sized systems with Lumin. Now, with that being said, I want to be clear about the last point there, and that is smaller systems do still come with some limitations. For example, maybe the customer might want a bigger ESS for extended grid outages. Maybe they want to self-consume more load for a longer period of time. Maybe they just want to be super green and offset as much carbon as possible. So solar salespeople will need to have these types of discussions with their customers, and they will be of increased importance. But nevertheless, you can build a small, big, medium-sized system as long as Lumin is injecting intelligence into that system. All right, so lastly here, just want to give you a high-level overview of how Lumin is installed. We do have technical trainings every Thursday, installation trainings that will go into way more depth than what I'm about to go. But I want to kind of give you an idea of how this all works. We are simply intercepting the circuit on the way to the load. It's really just a two-step process. So you see the traditional setup there in number one, where you're going from breaker to load. So what we're going to do with Lumin is we're going to disconnect that load wire and from the breaker, and we are going to attach that load wire onto one of our blue controllable wires, and that blue wire will be labeled load. So you just connect the two load wires together, and you can do that something as simple as a wire nut. And then there's a corresponding blue wire, which says breaker, and that one goes to the breaker. So now, instead of going from breaker to load as this traditional way, we go from breaker to Lumin device to load. One thing I'll add is that we can control any circuit up to 60 amps. We can install up to 6 dual pole circuit breakers, or up to 12 single pole circuit breakers, or any combination thereof. These units are stackable, so if you need to control more than a max of 12 circuits, you can do that. We've had upwards of several. I mean, certainly up to 5 at least. But normally, one Lumin smart panel suffices. We kind of go by the 80-20 rule a little bit, where 80% of your loads are typically 20% of your loads are 80% of your bill. So that 80-20 rule. Yeah, so with that, I believe this is my last slide. Yep, I'm going to pass it back over to John to round this out over here, talk a little bit more about how the IRA figures into this, and then we'll answer some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ricky. That was super insightful. I think some of the things that you touched on, we've talked a lot about sales process and positioning and how to think differently a little bit under NEM 3. But I think for a lot of the solar companies in the market that maybe have done some storage or have kind of been on the sidelines a little bit just to make sure they were fully ready. Now, as we're getting kind of pushed into storage in California, it sounds to me like the Lumin Smart Panel will just make that process a lot easier. It'll take away some of the guesswork for the sales folks, and then preventing some of that nuisance tripping to avoid truck rolls. I think all of those are also really important things that that we can look forward to with the Lumin Smart Panel. So we've talked about NEM 3, we've talked about Lumin, we've talked about the Lumin Smart Panel. Kind of wanted to round things out today by talking about some other incentives that are kind of earmarked for technology like the Lumin Smart Panel. So for those of you that haven't read through the multiple 100-page IRA document, there was a really interesting article published by Energy Sage recently that kind of distilled everything down to stuff that people like myself can understand. There are 3 incentives that cross over into the EMS, energy management system category that we should all be aware of. The first I'll talk about is the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Act. So if you are selling into areas that are low to mid income, there's actually some pretty lucrative incentives that the Lumin Smart Panel would qualify for, as much as up to $4,000 for upgrading the electrical panel, $2,500 towards the corresponding wiring. 2 that every customer should qualify for. The first is the Energy Efficient Home Credit, up to $600 towards an EMS, or 30%, whichever is lesser. So typically, you'll probably round that out at about $600. And then finally, the Residential Clean Energy Credit, which is 30% of the total cost, similar to 30% of the PV and of the ESS. So if you look at a typical installation where the net cost or the gross cost of the customer might come in at around $4,000, you can get the EEHC incentive for your customer at $600, and then the Residential Clean Energy Credit at about $1,200. So creating about $1,800 in incentive for your customer. bringing their net cost to $2,200. Now, in a previous slide, we showed you how you can leverage technologies like Lumin and the Lumin Smart Panel to create around $2,000 of net metering value within the course of a year. So for a lot of customers, if presented, the Lumin Smart Panel is really going to be a no-brainer. And I encourage everyone, study up on the IRA and make sure you're tapping into as many of those incentives for your customer. There's a lot of stuff that's out there. It's just kind of, some of it can be a bit complex and you have to sift through the weeds a little bit. But again, I think, if presented properly, a lot of value for your customer. And from an installation perspective, you've got these things installed in maybe 1 or 2 hours. So not a huge lift for your installation crews. So if you want to learn more, some of the services that we can provide for your team right away, certainly doing sales trainings with your team. We've got a group that can perform technical trainings. We can do single line reviews, especially for those first few projects, and then product demos. One of the things that we didn't do today that we would do in a product demo or a sales training is really give you insight into the customer facing app to show you exactly how customers will navigate through the Lumin app, create those priorities, set those schedules and those preferences. So really a fun way to learn about the product. And again, when customers adopt this technology, the app is sort of the tip of the spear as far as their general awareness of the product and how to get the most out of it. If you're interested in installing your first Lumin Smart Panel, we should have mentioned there is a certification process. So please do register for our certification training. Maybe in a moment, Phil can talk about when the next one is going to be. But in the meantime, if you want to start looking at getting pricing so you can spec these into your project, we've listed our distribution partners below. If you speak to a distributor and you don't get the information that you need, absolutely make sure you reach out to Ricky. He is responsible for all of our distribution efforts in the western portion of the country, so he'll certainly be there to take care of you. And with all of that said, we would like to. How much time do we have here? We did well. We've got a little over 15 minutes for Q&A. So if there are any questions from the group, now would be a great time to let your voices be heard.
All right, yeah, thanks so much, guys, for sitting in to our presentation. I am going to I'm going to unmute everybody as soon as I figure out how to do that.
Or you could write the questions in the chat if that's easier.
Yeah, you can also please feel free to write the question in the chat.
This is Emmett. How you guys doing today? I was just wondering about the Thursday certification training. Is that you sign up for that on the installer page from your website?
You know what? I'll put the link to it in well, shoot, if I put it in the chat, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I'll post the link to it here in just a second.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, it's every Thursday at 8 a.m. I believe. Is that correct? 8 a.m. Pacific time. Is that correct?
8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
And let's see, to everyone, if you want to register for that weekly webinar, you can do so at the link that I just put in the chat. Also, give me a thumbs up that actually reached you, because
yeah, I saw it coming.
okay, great. I had it on chat just between host and panelist before.
Oh, okay. I don't have visibility into the Q&A, Phil. If there's anything that comes in,
well,
can you?
Chat is disabled.
Q&A is open though.
Okay.
Frank Evans just asked if we can make the presentation available to those on the call. Absolutely, Frank. We will follow up in an email.
Yeah, and we can send over the certified installer training registration in the email as well. Just have a link to register for that, but it's, yeah, as Ricky mentioned, it's every Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Takes about an hour.
Phil and John, if you can see any questions coming in.
I'm
Not sure
watching.
why. Yeah.
Ricky, we were so informative that
Yeah. Our work here is done, I guess. No. I mean, certainly if any questions arise later, I think the very last slide here is our contact information. I mean, we could even get that up right now. Some questions will arise. If you have some immediate projects you're working on and you want to go over some ideas, heck, email all of us. It's fine. Whatever you like. And we're happy to, as John mentioned, we can do a specific demo for your sales teams, and we can do the training for your installation teams on Thursdays. The demos we can set up at a mutually beneficial time. So if you want those set up, again, you can contact any of us.
All right, well,
and we
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, we will be doing 2 more of these sessions. So if you have any friends in the industry and if you like what you heard today, please let them know. I think a lot of folks are kind of heads down right now, but before you know it, we're going to be middle April. And so now is the time to really get our heads around what's coming. So yeah, definitely please do recommend the training. We've got 2 more. One next month, one the following. So happy to help those in need for sure.
And if we don't have any other questions, we are at quarter till. So I will give everyone 15 minutes of their day back and close the presentation. Guys, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye now.